Imagine a missile that could fly for months without refueling, skimming just above the ground at supersonic speeds, spewing radioactive death in its wake, and carrying enough nuclear warheads to obliterate 16 cities before finally crashing and creating one last atomic explosion. This wasn't science fiction, this was Project Pluto, and it remains one of the most terrifying weapons ever conceived by the human mind. During the height of the Cold War, when the United States and Soviet Union were locked in a desperate race for nuclear supremacy, American engineers proposed something that seemed to come straight from a nightmare. They wanted to build a missile powered by an unshielded nuclear reactor, a weapon so dangerous that even testing it posed catastrophic risks to everyone involved. The scientists who worked on Project Pluto weren't just pushing the boundaries of technology. They were venturing into territory that made even hardened military strategists uncomfortable. The story begins in January 1957, when the United States Air Force approached the Lawrence Radiation Laboratory with an audacious question. Could they build a nuclear-powered Ramjet engine for a cruise missile? The concept was deceptively simple but monumentally challenging. Unlike conventional rockets that carry their own oxidizer, a Ramjet breathes air from the atmosphere, compressing it through sheer speed before mixing it with fuel and igniting it. The Air Force wanted to replace traditional jet fuel with a nuclear reactor that would superheat the incoming air to tremendous temperatures, creating thrust without ever needing to refuel. The strategic logic was compelling. Intercontinental ballistic missiles, which were being developed simultaneously, had one critical weakness. Their trajectories were predictable. Once launched, they followed a ballistic arc that enemy radar could track and potentially intercept. A low-altitude cruise missile, on the other hand, could fly beneath radar coverage, following terrain and making last-minute course corrections. And if that missile never needed to refuel, it could stay airborne indefinitely, circling over the ocean until commanded to strike, or taking the longest possible route to confuse enemy defenses. The engineers at Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, led by Dr. Theodore Merkel, embraced the challenge with characteristic Cold War enthusiasm. They named their creation SLAM, which stood for Supersonic Low-Altitude Missile, though some insiders grimly joked it also described what the missile would do to anything in its path. The initial specifications were staggering. SLAM would cruise at Mach 3, roughly 3 times the speed of sound. It would fly at altitudes between 500 and 1,000 feet, low enough to avoid most radar detection, but high enough to clear obstacles. Most remarkably, its nuclear Ramjet engine could theoretically keep it airborne for months. To understand why Project Pluto was so revolutionary and so dangerous, you need to understand how the nuclear Ramjet worked. At the heart of the engine was a reactor unlike any built before or since. Traditional nuclear reactors, like those in submarines or power plants, are heavily shielded to protect people from deadly radiation. They also use control rods and cooling systems to carefully manage the nuclear reaction. The Pluto reactor had none of these safety features. It was essentially a naked nuclear core designed to run as hot as possible. The reactor core consisted of hundreds of thousands of pencil-sized fuel elements made from ceramic uranium oxide. When the missile reached operating speed, air would be rammed into the front of the engine, compressed by the sheer velocity of the missile, and forced through channels in the nuclear core. The reactor would heat this air to temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. This superheated air would then blast out the back of the engine, creating thrust. No moving parts, no turbines, just nuclear fire and compressed air. In May 1961, engineers successfully tested the first prototype reactor, called Tory-2A, at the Nuclear Rocket Development Station in the Nevada desert. The test was both triumphant and terrifying. The reactor operated exactly as designed, producing the intense heat needed for Ramjet propulsion. But it also confirmed everyone's worst fears about the hazards involved. The unshielded reactor sprayed radiation in all directions. The exhaust plume was laced with radioactive particles. Even after shutdown, the reactor remained dangerously hot and radioactive for extended periods. Despite these concerns, the program pushed forward. In 1964, they tested an improved version called Tory-2C. This reactor was even more powerful, designed to actually propel a missile rather than just prove the concept. The test again succeeded technically. The reactor achieved the temperatures and thrust levels needed for flight. Engineers proved that a nuclear Ramjet could work. But with each success, the horrifying implications of the weapon became more apparent. Let's consider what an operational SLAM missile would actually do. The mission would begin with a rocket booster launching the missile and accelerating it to the speed where the Ramjet could take over. Once at operational velocity, the nuclear reactor would ignite and the missile would descend to low altitude. From that moment on, SLAM would become a flying apocalypse. as it screamed across the landscape at 3 times the speed of sound, flying lower than many skyscrapers are tall. The missile would create a devastating sonic boom that would shatter windows and damage structures along its entire path. The unshielded nuclear reactor would spray intense gamma radiation across the countryside below. Any living thing close to the flight path would receive a lethal radiation dose. The engine exhaust would spew radioactive particles that would contaminate everything downwind for miles. But this was just the delivery system. SLAM was designed to carry between 14 and 16 hydrogen bombs, each many times more powerful than the weapons dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The missile's computer would guide it across enemy territory, selecting targets along a programmed route. It would release its nuclear payload one by one, obliterating cities and military installations across thousands of miles. And because the nuclear ramjet could theoretically operate for months, SLAM could take the most circuitous route imaginable, striking from unexpected directions and hitting targets that seemed far beyond range. The final horror came at mission's end. After releasing all its warheads, SLAM wouldn't simply shut down and fall harmlessly from the sky. The plan called for the missile to make a terminal dive into a final target, with the reactor itself creating one last atomic explosion when it impacted at supersonic speed and disintegrated. It was a weapon designed to kill even in death. Military planners proposed keeping SLAM missiles on constant airborne patrol, circling over international waters, ready to strike on command. The psychological impact on the Soviet Union would be immense. How do you defend against a weapon that's already airborne, that can approach from any direction, that flies too low for most radar, and that spreads radiation even before dropping its bombs? Conventional air defenses would struggle to intercept something moving Mach 3 just a few hundred feet off the ground. But as the engineers refined their designs and the military planners wargamed scenarios, a growing sense of unease spread through the program. Project Pluto wasn't just a weapon. It was almost a weapon against humanity itself. The environmental contamination from even testing a full-scale prototype would be enormous. An actual combat mission would be an ecological catastrophe regardless of whether the nuclear warheads were ever released. The radiation from the engine alone would kill countless civilians who had nothing to do with military targets. There were practical concerns too. What if a SLAM missile malfunctioned during a training flight over the United States? What if one crashed shortly after launch? The unshielded reactor couldn't be safely shut down. A crashed SLAM would be like a dirty bomb, spreading radioactive contamination across a wide area. And if the Soviets developed their own version, American cities would face the same terrifying threat. International treaties were another consideration. The Limited Test Ban Treaty of 1963 prohibited nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere, underwater, and in outer space. While SLAM didn't technically violate this treaty since it wasn't a test, the spirit of the agreement clearly opposed weapons that spread radiation indiscriminately. Deploying SLAM would likely trigger an arms race in similarly horrific weapons, each side trying to outdo the other in creating unstoppable doomsday devices. By 1964, the strategic landscape was also changing. Intercontinental ballistic missiles had matured significantly. They were faster, more reliable, and increasingly accurate. Submarine-launched ballistic missiles provided an invulnerable second strike capability. The Navy's Polaris program proved that missiles launched from hidden submarines were just as effective at deterrence as complex cruise missiles, without the environmental nightmares. The costs were staggering too. Project Pluto had consumed over $260 million by 1964, equivalent to well over $2 billion today. And this was just for research and development. Actually building and deploying operational SLAM missiles would cost vastly more. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, known for his analytical approach to military spending, looked at the numbers and the strategic alternatives and found Pluto wanting. In July 1964, the Air Force and the Atomic Energy Commission quietly canceled Project Pluto. The official reasons cited were the changing strategic environment and the development of alternative weapon systems. But those involved knew the real reason. They had created something that worked perfectly from an engineering standpoint, but was simply too terrible to actually use. SLAM was a weapon that would poison the Earth even as it destroyed its targets, a missile that killed indiscriminately long before it dropped a single bomb. The legacy of Project Pluto is complex. On one hand, it represents an extraordinary engineering achievement. Scientists and engineers solved seemingly impossible problems in materials science, nuclear reactor design, and high-speed aerodynamics. They proved that a nuclear ramjet could work, that you could indeed build a missile that flew on atomic fire. The technical knowledge gained from Pluto contributed to other programs including nuclear rocket designs for space exploration. On the other hand, Project Pluto stands as a cautionary tale about the dangers of pursuing technology without fully considering the moral and environmental implications. It's a reminder that just because we can build something doesn't mean we should. The engineers who worked on Pluto were brilliant, dedicated professionals doing their best to protect their country during a terrifying period in history. But they were designing a weapon that would have made the world a darker, more dangerous place. Today, the test site in Nevada where the Tory reactors burned still exists, though it's contaminated and off-limits. The reactors themselves were eventually buried in radioactive waste disposal sites. The blueprints and technical data remain classified, locked away in government archives. Occasionally, declassified documents surface, giving historians glimpses into this forgotten chapter of Cold War history. Project Pluto never flew. No SLAM missile ever screamed across the landscape, trailing radiation and death. And for that, we should be grateful. It remains frozen in time as a relic of an era when the superpowers were willing to contemplate almost any horror in their struggle for dominance. The nuclear Ramjet missile that terrified everyone never dropped a single bomb, never killed a single person. But its mere existence, even just as a research program, reminds us how close humanity came to unleashing weapons that would have made the world uninhabitable. The story of Project Pluto is ultimately about limits, about recognizing that some lines should not be crossed, that some weapons are too terrible even for war. In canceling the program, American leaders made a choice to step back from the abyss. They decided that even in the desperate struggle against the Soviet Union, some victories would cost too much. Project Pluto stands as a testament to human ingenuity, human hubris, and ultimately, to a moment of human wisdom when we chose not to build the doomsday weapon we had designed.